The year was 1888, and the wind in the Wyoming Territory already carried the scent of a punishing winter. It was a lean, hungry wind that scoured the color from the grasslands, leaving behind a pale, monolithic ochre that stretched to the bruised purple of the distant mountains. For the handful of souls settled in the thin valley along the Laramie River, autumn was not a season of harvest and plenty, but a frantic, desperate scramble against a coming siege. It was a time for banking sod against foundations, for caulking logs with mud and moss, and for the grim calculus of hay and firewood. For Elara Vance, it was a season of impossible labor, a spectacle of such strangeness that it brought the work of her neighbors to a dead halt. They stood at the edges of their own properties, hands shading their eyes, and watched the widow wrestle with the ghost of a riverboat. It was the hull of a shallow draft barge, a great skeletal beast left stranded by the furious spring melt 2 years prior. The flood had torn it from its moorings upriver and abandoned it in a stand of cottonwoods a half-mile from her cabin, where it had lain ever since, its timbers bleaching in the sun and its iron fittings weeping rust. Most saw it as an eyesore, a monument to futility. Elara saw something else. For 6 weeks, from the first light of dawn until the evening chill drove her indoors, she had been engaged in the monumental task of moving it. She had felled young pines to serve as rollers, constructed a crude but functional capstan from a massive stump, and learned the intricate language of leverage and strain. Now, the monstrous curve of the hull, 30 feet long and 12 wide, sat poised on the rise just above her small, vulnerable cabin, a dark arc waiting for a flood of snow and ice. Her husband, Thomas, had built the cabin. He had been a man of grand visions and hasty execution, a soul who saw the finished cathedral but neglected to measure the foundation stones. The structure was a testament to his character, ambitious in its placement, with a fine view of the river, but utterly heedless of the prevailing northwest wind that had an uninterrupted run of 50 miles to build its force. The log walls were too thin, the chinking was already crumbling, and the roof, a shallow pitch of split logs and sod, had been a constant source of leaks and drafts. Thomas had died of a fever in their second winter, leaving Elara with the cabin, 10 acres of rocky soil, and a silence that was deeper and colder than any snowdrift. In her 2 years alone, she had learned that the wind was not merely weather, it was a predator. It stalked the house, seeking entry, testing every seam, and its howling was the sound of her life's warmth being stolen, bit by bit. Amos Kelleher was the first to approach, his boots crunching on the brittle grass. He was a practical man who measured the world in cords of wood and bushels of corn, and he saw Elara's project not as innovation, but as a symptom of grief-addled delusion. He stopped a respectful distance away, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, his face a mask of sincere, if condescending, concern. "Elara," he began, his voice a low rumble meant to convey gentle authority. "What in God's name are you doing?" He gestured with his chin toward the looming hull. "That thing must weigh 2 tons. You can't mean to put it on your roof. It'll crush the place flat before the first snow." Elara paused in her work, wiping a smear of pine pitch from her cheek with the back of her glove. She regarded Amos with a steady, unreadable gaze. "It's not going on the roof, Amos. It's going over it." She turned and pointed to the 4 stout oak posts she had sunk into the ground, 2 on each side of the cabin, their tops level and waiting. "It will rest on those. There will be a gap." His wife, Dora, had followed him at a distance and now stood with her arms crossed, a posture of bundled pity. She saw a poor widow, broken by loss and solitude, engaged in a mad, heartbreaking folly. The whole valley saw it. They called it Elara's folly, a name spoken sometimes with a shake of the head, sometimes with a quiet chuckle. Amusement was a safer position than attempting to understand.
A gap?
Amos squinted, trying to picture it, but his imagination was as square and practical as the barns he built. What good is a gap? The wind will get in, the snow will get in. You're building yourself a tunnel for the winter to live in. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Ilara, this is not the way. You need to bank your walls higher. Put another layer of sod on the roof. That's the proven way. We can help you. The men can have it done in a day. It was a genuine offer, born of a community instinct to protect its own, but it was predicated on the assumption that she was weak and confused. He saw a problem of material, of insufficient mass. He could not see that her solution was about something else entirely. She gave a small, weary shake of her head. "The wind, Amos," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You're thinking of blocking the wind. You can't block it. It's stronger than logs and sod. The harder you block it, the harder it pushes. It finds every crack. It drives the cold through the walls." She looked past him, her eyes fixed on the flow of the river in the distance, seeing a different kind of current. "You don't block it. You have to guide it. You have to make it go where you want it to go." Amos stared at her as if she had started speaking in tongues. He exchanged a look with Dora, a quick, silent confirmation that this was worse than they thought. He saw only a woman talking nonsense about guiding the wind, a force as immutable and hostile as God's own wrath. He saw madness. Ilara did not try to explain further. She had tried once before, weeks ago, and his face had gone blank. Watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the principle. Her knowledge was of a different sort, inherited not from the traditions of the plains but from the shipyards of the Great Lakes. Her father had been a shipwright, a master of hull design. He had been a quiet, methodical man who smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and he had taught her to see the unseen. He had taught her that water and air were siblings, governed by the same laws of flow, of pressure, of turbulence. He would place a carved model of a hull in a stream and have her watch how the water parted, how it curled in on itself, how it created eddies and zones of calm in its lee. "Nature abhors a flat surface, Ilara," he would say, his finger tracing the elegant curve of a ship's bow. "A wall is a challenge. A curve is a suggestion." She remembered one lesson with piercing clarity. He had taken her out in a vicious winter squall on Lake Erie, the air thick with snow that flew not down, but sideways. They had sheltered behind a large, rounded boulder on the shore. The wind shrieked over the top of the stone, a physical wall of sound and force. Yet in the space directly behind it, the air was almost still. The snow, instead of piling up against the rock, was scoured away from its base, forming a deep, clean crescent a few feet away. "Look!" her father had yelled over the gale, pointing. "The wind makes its own shelter. It carves out the space. The rock doesn't fight the wind, it shapes it. It tells the snow where to fall." It was a principle she had never forgotten. The power of the curve, the science of the void. The way a properly shaped object could command the very air around it. That was the first principle. The second was the air gap. Her father had built their home with it, an inner wall and an outer wall with a 6-inch space between. The neighbors had scoffed, calling it a waste of wood, but in the depths of a Michigan winter, their house was warm and dry while others were lined with frost. "The cold doesn't travel through the wood, girl," he explained, tapping the inner wall. "It travels through the air. But still, air, trapped air, is the best blanket in the world. It's not the wall that keeps you warm. It's the air the wall holds still." The barge hull, resting on its posts above her cabin, would not be a roof. It would be an outer wall, a carapace. The space between the hull and the cabin roof would be a thick blanket of still, trapped air, an insulator more effective than any amount of sod or timber Thomas could have piled on top. The wind would be guided, and the cold would be trapped. It was a complete system, elegant and whole in her mind. Explaining this to Amos was like describing color to a man born blind. He lived in a world of brute force and perpendicular angles. He fought the winter by building thicker walls, which the winter then attacked with greater force. He saw the hull as a heavy, dead thing. Alara saw it as an instrument, perfectly shaped for its purpose. So she simply turned back to her work, leaving the Kelleher's to their pity and their certainty. The final stage of the work was the most dangerous and precise. The hull had to be moved the last 10 feet and settled onto the 4 oak posts. It required a delicate balance of pushing, pulling, and braking. She worked with her system of levers and her creaking capstan, her small frame orchestrating the immense weight with a patience that was almost geological in its scale. The wood groaned, the ropes strained, and the ground trembled, but inch by inch, the dark shape slid into place. The process took 3 days. She would gain a foot of progress and spend an hour checking every rope, every roller, every anchor point. Her hands were raw, her muscles ached with a fire that never cooled. But her focus was absolute. She ate standing up, quick bites of jerky and hard bread, her eyes never leaving the task. She slept in brief, dreamless blocks, her mind still calculating angles and stresses. The community watched from afar. The men, gathered at the smithy, spoke of it with a kind of grim fascination. They laid bets on when the cabin would collapse, on whether the hull would slide off the posts and crush the back wall, or simply split apart under its own unsupported weight. It was a morbid entertainment to pass the time before winter sealed them all in their homes. Ruth Hartley, a widow herself who lived on the far side of the valley, was the only one who watched with something other than mockery. She saw not madness, but a desperate, profound intention, and she kept her thoughts to herself. On the 3rd afternoon, with the sun low and the air turning sharp, the final roller was removed. There was a deep, resonant thump that echoed across the valley as the full weight of the barge hull settled onto the oak posts. For a long moment, Alara did not move. She simply stood, listening. She heard the faint creak of the posts compressing, the sigh of the massive timbers finding their rest. The cabin beneath was untouched. The gap, a space of about 18 inches, was perfect. A wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost dizzying washed over her, but it was followed by a current of pure, quiet triumph. She had done it. The great beast was tamed. But the work was not over. The structure was in place, but the system was not yet complete. For the next 2 weeks, she worked to seal the perimeter. She gathered stones from the riverbed, flat and heavy, and built a low, sturdy wall around the base of the oak posts, creating a foundation for the outer shell. Then, she began the painstaking work of cutting and stacking sod bricks, packing them tightly against the outside of the stone foundation and up along the lower curve of the hull. She worked with the precision of a mason, fitting the dark, root-threaded bricks together, filling every gap with packed earth. She was not just building a wall, she was creating a seamless transition between the earth and the hull, making them one continuous aerodynamic form. From a distance, it began to look less like a boat dropped on a house and more like a natural formation, a peculiar, elongated hillock that had grown organically from the prairie. She saved the north-facing side for last, the side that would meet the full fury of the prevailing wind. Here, she extended the sod work outwards, creating a long, gently sloping ramp that rose from the ground to meet the hull about a third of the way up its side. This was her final refinement of her father's principle. The boulder on the lakeshore had been a blunt instrument. This was a finely tuned tool. The ramp would not present an obstacle for the wind to smash against. It would lift it. It would guide the current of air up and over the curved spine of the hull, increasing its velocity and, with it, its power to scour the snow away. She created a small, protected alcove around her door on the south side, using the natural curve of the stern, and built a low wall to shelter her woodpile under the wide overhang. Every detail was a product of observation and memory, a physical manifestation of a lifetime of quiet learning. By the time the first flakes of snow began to drift down from a sky the color of lead, her creation was complete. The valley had grown used to the strange sight of it, and the initial amusement had hardened into a kind of settled, sad conviction. The consensus was that the structure, while perhaps not as immediately catastrophic as they had predicted, was a colossal waste of effort. It was dark, ugly, and drafty, they assumed. Poor Alara Vance would spend the winter colder and more miserable than ever in her bizarre fortress of folly. Amos Kelleher, having finished banking his own sturdy, conventional home, looked upon her work with a final, pitying shake of his head before turning his attention to his own affairs. Winter was no time for worrying about the choices of a fool. The first blizzard arrived not with a gentle prelude, but as an outright assault. The world vanished in a blinding fury of white. The wind came as a solid wall of sound, a shrieking, deafening roar that vibrated in the bones. In cabins across the valley, families huddled close to their stoves, listening to the timbers of their homes groan and pop under the strain. They stuffed rags into the cracks around doors and windows, fighting the insidious infiltration of fine, powdery snow that seemed to materialize from thin air. The wind was a physical presence, pressing against the walls, rattling the shutters, stealing the heat with a relentless, insatiable hunger. This was the crucible. This was the test that would validate the principle or condemn the woman who had trusted it. Inside her cabin, Alara sat in a stillness that was utterly profound. She had stoked her small iron stove until it glowed a dull cherry red, and the air was filled with a dry, steady warmth. She had expected sound, a drumming of wind on the hull, a roar of passage, but there was almost nothing. The shrieking of the gale was a distant thing, a high, thin whine that seemed to be happening far above her. The thick blanket of air trapped between her cabin roof and the hull was doing its work, damping the vibration, insulating her from the auditory violence of the storm. She could hear the familiar groans of her own cabin's logs, but they were faint, the complaints of a structure under a load it no longer had to bear alone. The primary assault was being met and deflected by the silent, curved shield a foot and a half above her head. She spent the first day of the storm in a state of quiet, focused observation. She moved through the small space, laying her bare hand against the log walls. They were cool, but not the biting, soul-leeching cold she was used to. The frigid temperature of the outside world was being held at bay. She checked the seams around the door and the single window. There were no drafts. The fine, whispering streams of snow that had always found their way in were absent. The wind, instead of pressing and probing, was flowing smoothly over her shelter, its immense power harnessed and redirected, rendered harmless by a simple, elegant curve. She lit a single candle and watched its flame. It burned straight and tall, unwavering, a perfect pillar of light in the heart of the storm. For 2 years, a candle flame in this cabin during a winter blow had danced and flickered wildly, a frantic moth fighting for its life. This steady, placid flame was the most powerful proof she could have asked for. The storm raged for 3 days. To the rest of the valley, it was an ordeal, a period of confinement and anxiety. They measured the passage of time by the rising drifts that blocked their windows and the dwindling stacks of firewood beside their hearths. They worried about their livestock and the integrity of their roofs under the mounting weight of the snow. For Alara, it was a time of deep, unshakable peace. She moved with a calm, unhurried rhythm, tending her stove with a surprisingly small amount of wood. The heat she produced was now staying in the cabin, not being immediately stolen by the wind. She cooked a small pot of stew, the savory smell filling the small space, a scent of warmth and life. She slept soundly, wrapped in her quilts, feeling not besieged, but protected. She was not hiding from the winter, she was living within it, insulated by a principle as solid and reliable as the earth itself. She felt a profound connection to her father, a sense of having finally, fully understood the lessons he had taught not with words, but with wood and water and wind. On the morning of the fourth day, she awoke to silence. The wind had gone. The silence was absolute, a heavy, muffled stillness that meant the world was buried deep in snow. In previous years, this was the moment she dreaded. It meant the back-breaking labor of digging out, of tunneling through a drift that would have completely entombed her door. She would have to climb out the window, shovel in hand, and begin the arduous process of freeing herself. This time, she felt no dread, only a quiet curiosity. She banked the fire in the stove, pulled on her heavy coat and boots, and lifted the latch on the door. It swung inwards without a whisper of resistance. She stepped out into the protected alcove she had designed and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The world was a blinding, seamless expanse of white, sculpted by the storm into fantastic shapes. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, but it was the landscape immediately around her that held her transfixed. A massive drift, at least 10 feet high, rose in a great, sweeping wave, but its crest was a good 15 feet away from her cabin. The wind, lifted by her sawed ramp and accelerated over the hull, had acted like a giant's shovel, scouring the area around her shelter almost completely clean. The snow had been carried and dumped far beyond her walls. A gentle slope of powder lay in front of her door, no more than a few inches deep. Her woodpile, tucked neatly under the overhang of the hull, was entirely free of snow, the split logs dry and ready. The hull itself, its dark, tarred wood arching against the blue sky, was largely bare, with only a thin plume of white clinging to its leeward side. It had worked. It had worked more perfectly than she had even dared to imagine. She took a few steps out, her boots sinking slightly into the light powder, and looked back at her home. It looked like a creature of the earth, a dark turtle burrowed into the snow for the winter, its curved shell deflecting the elements. It was a picture of serene, unassailable strength. For a long moment, she simply stood there, absorbing the sight, the feeling of the clean, cold air, the profound quiet of the snow-covered world. It was a victory not of strength against strength, but of intelligence against chaos. She had not defeated the wind, she had befriended it. She had used its own power to create her sanctuary. A slow smile spread across her face, a feeling of quiet, internal vindication that was more satisfying than any spoken praise. She thought of her father and wished he could see it. He would not have been surprised. He would have simply nodded, a small glint of pride in his eyes, and said, "Yes, that is the way of it." It was another full day before she saw any sign of her neighbors. The valley was digging itself out. She could see plumes of smoke rising from chimneys that were just barely poking above the snow line. Then she saw movement. It was Amos Kelleher working with a shovel, his figure small and dark against the vast white. He was not clearing a path from his door. He was trying to get to his woodshed. The wind, smashing directly into the flat wall of his outbuilding, had created a massive eddy, dumping an enormous drift that had completely buried it. As Alara watched, he finally cleared enough snow to reveal the top of the structure, or what was left of it. The roof had collapsed under the immense weight. He stood there for a long time, shovel resting in the snow, a figure of defeat. Then his head turned, and he looked across the valley toward her cabin. Even from this distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze. He could see her standing outside her door. He could see her clear, accessible woodpile. He could see the impossible geometry of the snowdrifts around her home. It was a scene that defied every principle of winter he had ever known. After a few minutes, he shouldered his shovel and began to trudge through the deep snow, making his way toward her. The journey took him nearly half an hour, each step a struggle through the waist-deep drifts. When he finally arrived, he was breathing heavily, his face red from the cold and the exertion. He did not look at her at first. His eyes were fixed on the hull, on the sod ramp, on the bare ground around the cabin's foundation. He walked the perimeter, his boots crunching, his gaze taking in every detail. He ran a gloved hand along the smooth, curved wood. He looked at the deep, scoured-out crescent where a drift should have been. He was a man confronting a truth that invalidated a lifetime of experience. He was a carpenter staring at a joint that should have been impossible, yet held firm. Finally, he stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, his expression stripped of all its former condescension. In its place was a raw, grudging respect. He gestured vaguely with his shovel at the entire structure. "My woodshed's gone," he said, his voice flat. "Roof collapsed. The drift against the north wall of my house is 12 feet deep. It took me and my boy 2 hours just to clear the door." He paused, then looked directly at her. "You have no drift at all." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of profound disbelief. Alara simply nodded. She felt no need to explain it all again. The proof was all around them, written in the snow. "The wind guided it away," she said simply. Amos looked at the curve of the hull one last time, a flicker of understanding finally dawning in his practical mind. He saw the shape, and he saw the result, and for the first time, he connected the two. He shook his head slowly, a small, weary sigh escaping his lips. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, more to himself than to her. It was the plainest, most profound admission of fallibility she had ever heard. He then cleared his throat. "I'll need to borrow some wood, Alara, just until I can get to what's left of mine." It was the ultimate concession. The man who had pitied her folly now needed the help her folly provided. "Of course, Amos," she said, and gestured to the dry, waiting stack. That winter was one of the harshest in memory. 2 more great blizzards swept through the territory, and the cold was a constant, biting presence. But while the rest of the valley struggled, burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate and living in a state of constant, drafty chill, Alara lived in a cocoon of warmth and quiet. Her system performed flawlessly. The snow never accumulated, the wind never penetrated, and her home became a small island of unlikely comfort in the frozen sea of the prairie. Word of it spread. After the second blizzard, Ruth Hartley made the long trek across the valley, bringing a freshly baked loaf of bread as a gift. She did not ask for help. She came to see, to understand. She sat in Alara's warm cabin, sipping hot tea, her eyes wide with a quiet, appreciative awe. She was the first to understand not just that it worked, but why. When spring finally came and the great melt began, the valley looked upon Alara Vance differently. Her folly was no longer a folly. It was a marvel. The men who had laid bets on its collapse now came to her, hats in hand. their questions no longer tinged with ridicule but with genuine curiosity. Amos Kelleher was foremost among them. He asked her to explain it again, the idea of guiding the wind, of the insulating gap. This time he listened. He brought others with him, and Alara, standing in the warm spring sun beside her strange and beautiful shelter, explained her father's principles. She spoke of curves and currents, of how yielding to a great force was sometimes a greater strength than resisting it. They listened, and they began to understand. The legacy of Alara's folly was written into the landscape of the valley over the next decade. The following autumn, Amos Kelleher built a new woodshed, its north-facing wall a long, gentle curve of steam-bent planking. Others began to incorporate curved roofs and sod ramps into their own structures. The term hullback entered the local vernacular to describe a building designed to shed the wind rather than block it. Alara's cabin, with its great, dark shell, stood for another 40 years, a landmark and a testament. Travelers passing through the valley would remark on its peculiar appearance, and locals would tell the story of the quiet widow who had listened to the wind and learned its secrets. The knowledge she brought, born of a shipwright's wisdom on a distant lake, became the new tradition, a principle of survival passed down through generations, proving that the most resilient structures are not always the ones that stand the tallest, but the ones that know how to bend.